Leave it to Elliotte Friedman to learn about all these interesting, weird, wild, wacky, and crazy things over the span of last year's offseason, and not talk about it at all until yesterday. We had ourselves a Canucks game against the Rangers, wherein Elliotte Friedman was doing the intermission segment from, they said it was his home office, but it kind of looked like a courtroom, not gonna lie. And on the segments, the multiple segments that he ended up doing, there was a little tidbit of information that Friedman spilled that I thought was super interesting that we just had to go out there and make a video about it. We're going over onto Buck Foston's Twitter account, and yeah, I had to say that pretty slowly there, Buck Foston, and their Twitter account, because what they did was they tweeted out what Friedman ended up saying in the show. According to Friedman, around the summertime, there were rumors of a JT Miller and Matthew Tkachuk trade with a third team. But he's not sure about it now. #Canucks. And this is such a simple tweet for such a basic idea, but it's one that if you try to explore it beyond the surface, adds so many different layers of intricacy and detail that makes this entire thing video worthy. Let's talk about the idea of a JT Miller and Matthew Tkachuk trade involving a third team. What options could have been there, assuming this sort of thing was actually existing, like if it actually was happening and it was talked about? What are the options that we could have seen in some sort of a Miller-Tkachuk three-way team swap sort of thing? And how could this have affected the Vancouver Canucks today? Let's head over to the profiles of both of these guys just to start out the conversation here. JT Miller, as we know, 29 years old, 6'1", 218, left-handed guy. He plays all forward positions, and he signed till the end of 2030, making $8 million a year starting in 2023-2024. This season, Miller has 45 points in 50 games played. He is on pace for 73 points in a full 81-game campaign, which would be a decline from the year he had last season, wherein he had 99 points. He was one away from 100. Everybody kind of knows that this was a pretty big landmark in Canucks point scoring prosperity because there aren't too many Canucks who have hit 100 points before. Miller was one away from doing that last year. The JT Miller thing is so intriguing because when you acknowledge that the Canucks did not sign the guy to that $8 million AAV extension until, let's say, the latter half of the summer, it makes it a lot easier to believe that, okay, because there was so much time the Canucks had before signing the contract, they were either A, working out that contract for a pretty good amount of time, or they were shopping Miller around and seeing what other trade offers were there for this guy and whether or not they'd be suitable as fits, etc., etc. And I think most people would agree that the latter is more likely the case here. We had seen trade rumors for JT Miller popping up throughout the past few months before that contract extension was signed, and it was a really big deal for the Canucks fan base trying to project where Miller was going to go. And so, with this idea in mind, if you acknowledge that Miller right now is on a 70-something-ish point pace, I'm gonna be honest, dude, like, $8 million a year for a player who gets 70 points a season isn't terrible. It is somewhat alarming seeing Miller at 29 years old starting to make that money until he's gonna be, 37? Like, that's not ideal at all. But at the end of the day, for what he is today, just right now, 70-point guy who could be a little bit better, produce 80, maybe 90 points in a season, it's kind of wild because he's been playing so quote-unquote poorly this year in the eyes of so many Canucks fans, myself included, but the guy is still finding a way to put himself on the score sheet more nights than not. So it's kind of interesting to me thinking about, Miller can be a lot better than what he is right now. And he's still doing okay, statistically at least. So aside from that, there still is another conversation to have about the contract comparison. Everybody was talking about Jamie Benn playing that similar hard-nosed winger type of style that Miller does, and Benn's contract was one that a lot of people saw fading away into not being all too valuable down the line. Well, unfortunately for that crowd, Jamie Benn has resurged a little bit this year, and I know it's not a great argument to say, oh, well, Jamie Benn's doing okay, and that guy's 33 years old, bouncing back from doing poorly in prior years, so why can't Miller do the same thing? It's not a good argument, but it's something to keep in mind that even though JT is making an extended amount of money, he is at the very least a capable scorer in the National Hockey League. Meanwhile, you go over to Matthew Tkachuk, the other guy that was also signed to a pretty big contract extension in the summer. He's 25 years old, 6'2", 201, left-handed guy, plays on both wings, and he is signed till 2030 as well, making 9.5 AAV, as opposed to Miller's 2030 expiring $8 million AAV deal. Matthew Tkachuk is just straight up a better player than Miller is. He's got 71 points this season in 50 games played, 27 goals, 44 assists. He is on pace for 113 total points in 79 games. Last year, he was a 100-point player, barely edging out JT's 99 with a 104-point season himself. Matthew Tkachuk is an agitator. He plays hard. He scores hard. He's a very good playmaker, and he's a 100-point caliber guy signed to less than $10 million a year. This is a really good hockey player. And when it comes to the idea of a potential JT Miller and Matthew Tkachuk trade that would have been a three-way trade with another team involved, you have to start asking the questions. Okay, if this was going to go down, would JT have gone to the Flames, or would he have gone to the third team involved? Would Matthew Tkachuk have gone to the Canucks, or would he have gone to the other team involved? Would this happen in just a normal sort of trade capacity, Miller for Tkachuk, but there was a third team to facilitate more draft picks and maybe retain salary in the short term? Who really knows? I personally doubt there would have been a team retaining because Matthew Tkachuk was signed to that extension in the summer. Miller was signed to the extension in the summer as well, but Miller's extension kicks in next year. So I don't really know if there would have been a third team that would have been able to, let's say, retain salary for the entire body's worth of time that these new contracts were handed out to. So I kind of doubt it was a salary thing per se. It kind of has to default to draft picks and prospects, wouldn't it have? I mean, when you think about it, Miller and Tkachuk both are top scorers, at least by definition, because they were 99-plus point players last year in the NHL. But just the idea, thinking about what a Matthew Tkachuk could be with the Vancouver Canucks alongside of an Elias Pettersson, for example. Like, I know we're talking all this talk about Andrei Kuzmenko and how he's probably the best line mate Petey has ever had, if you don't want to include JT Miller from the 649 days, but Matthew Tkachuk would be a step above everybody else Elias Pettersson has ever played with, period. That having that line, let's say Kuzmenko, Pettersson, and Tkachuk, that sounds like a match made in heaven. But of course, the Canucks would have needed to shell out some significant money to get Tkachuk to a contract, and you would have probably ended up leaving out Bo at the end of the day, because if you wanted to re-sign a guy like Matthew, you would have paid him more than you would have paid Miller, and Bo was still asking for all the money that he was in this season's worth of play. So who knows what revisionist history type story goes on if you swap out Miller for Tkachuk. And then, if you go over to the opposite side, let's say, hypothetically, Miller goes over to Calgary. This is the Calgary Canucks all over. Please don't tell me that I'm dreaming, because if you had yourselves a squad of Tanev, Toffoli, Markstrom, and JT Miller, then, yeah, no, that's kind of a nightmare, isn't it? And of course, because Miller is, like, legitimately okay at producing points at the NHL level, you know, with all those divisional matchups with Vancouver and Calgary, it's just gonna be another Canadian North Division Tyler Toffoli madness train like it had been a few years ago, right? He's gonna dominate. But, of course, you know, that's not at all what is guaranteed when you talk about a trade, three-way trade, because there would be a third team involved. Maybe it would have been something crazy like, I don't know, JT Miller to some other team, not Calgary. Matthew Tkachuk goes over to maybe Vancouver, and then another team sends Calgary some other crap. Like, who really knows? It would have been a weird sort of carousel that we don't really have all the details to fill in, since we kind of just don't know anything beyond maybe three-way trade with a third team. There probably would have been another player involved by the other squad, not just draft picks and extra stuff to make everything balance out, but at the end of the day, I did think it was a pretty interesting idea to just acknowledge that this might have been a conversation going on a little bit, that in which was shared by Elliot Friedman. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section below about this entire idea, a potential three-way trade involving JT Miller, Matthew Tkachuk, the Flames, the Canucks, and maybe some other team out there. And who do you think could have been that third team, the facilitator of the trade? Maybe another team that balances everything out with draft picks and prospects. If the Canucks traded away JT Miller for a guy like Matthew Tkachuk, for example, I think that blows out all the other proposals we had seen the past few months, like Niels Lundqvist and all the other guys from New York and all the other crap that we had seen rotating around, Boston, Columbus, all these other teams getting involved here, but of course, that is just my opinion. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below about Miller, Tkachuk, the Flames, Canucks, and any other trade idea. I hope you enjoyed this video. Juraj 99, and bye.